Imagine opening your mail to find a bill for $3,500. Not for a medical emergency or a home repair, but for the crime of growing tomatoes. That was the absurd reality for David, a 20-year Army veteran whose only wish was to enjoy a quiet retirement. He quickly discovered his new opponent wasn't on some distant battlefield, but was right next door, his power-tripping Homeowners Association. They thought they were simply finding a quiet gardener. They were about to learn they had provoked a master strategist who intended to win, using their own rulebook against them. You won't want to miss the moment the tables turn thanks to one critical piece of information. If this is your first time joining us, we invite you to subscribe to be part of our community. And please, feel free to share any stories you may have down in the comments. We read every one. The early morning sun in the suburbs of Tampa, Florida, had a quality all its own. It wasn't the harsh, demanding glare of midday, but a soft, golden wash that promised warmth without yet delivering its full, oppressive weight. It was in this gentle light that David Anderson found his sanctuary. His front yard was not the uniform, sterile green carpet that dominated the rest of the pristine Preserve at Cypress Creek community. His was an oasis of managed life, a testament to order and purpose. 4 raised garden beds, crafted from cedar that had weathered to a handsome silver gray, sat in a perfect square in the center of his lawn. They weren't just boxes of dirt. They were regiments, each plant standing in its designated place, a soldier in a vibrant living army. The tomato vines, heavy with blushing fruit, were trained up their stakes with the precision of communication wires on a forward operating base. The lettuces, romaine, butter, and red leaf, formed neat, dense rows of frilled color. Bell peppers, green and glossy, stood at attention next to columns of basil, whose fragrance was a sweet, peppery reveille on the humid morning air. For David, this wasn't a hobby, it was a ritual. After 20 years in the Army, specifically in logistics, his mind was a finely tuned instrument of order and process. He didn't just see plants, he saw supply chains. The sun provided energy. The automated drip irrigation system he'd installed delivered precisely measured hydration, and the rich compost he mixed himself was the fuel. His job had been to bring order to chaos in some of the most disordered places on Earth. Here, in his retirement, he simply continued the mission on a smaller, more peaceful scale. Each weed he plucked was a potential disruption neutralized. Each ripe vegetable he harvested was a successful outcome, a mission accomplished. The quiet, methodical work settled the lingering echoes of a loud and demanding past. This peace was hard-won, and he cherished it with a fierceness few could understand. He was just snipping a few leaves of mint for his morning tea when a shadow fell over the bed. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sharp, cloying scent of aggressive floral perfume always preceded her. "Good morning, Brenda," he said, his voice even and calm. He straightened up slowly, turning to face her. Brenda Thompson, chair of the Architectural Review Committee and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to keep her own organs from escaping. Her face, framed by a helmet of blonde hair that defied the Florida humidity, was a mask of distilled disapproval. She wasn't looking at him, but at his garden, as if it were a 10-car pileup on the community's main thoroughfare. "David," she began, her voice thin and tight, "we need to talk about this." She gestured vaguely at the vibrant green beds with a flick of her wrist, as if the very sight of them pained her. "My garden. It's having a good year. The tomatoes are especially sweet. Would you like some?" He offered this with genuine, if somewhat detached, politeness. In his old life, extending a small courtesy to a potentially hostile party was standard procedure. Brenda recoiled slightly, as if he'd offered her a live snake. "This isn't a farm, David. This is a respectable community with standards. People don't move to the preserve to look at agriculture." She said the word agriculture like it was a communicable disease. "It's a vegetable garden, Brenda. It's clean, it's contained, and it feeds myself and a few of the neighbors. I fail to see the issue." His heart rate remained perfectly steady. He'd been briefed by 4-star generals and faced down hostile warlords. A neighborhood busybody, even one armed with the authority of a homeowners association, didn't register as a threat. He classified her as an annoyance, a logistical snag. "The issue," she said, taking a small, aggressive step onto the very edge of his lawn, "is that it's an eyesore. It's not ornamental. Our covenants are very clear about landscaping. It's supposed to enhance the beauty of the community, not make it look like a rural flea market." David considered her words, his gaze sweeping over his handiwork. He saw the deep green of the pepper leaves, the cheerful red of the tomatoes, the almost blue hue of the kale. He saw the bees buzzing happily from flower to flower. To him, this was the very definition of beauty: life, function, and purpose all intertwined. He then glanced across the street at Brenda's own yard. It was a monoculture of perfectly manicured St. Augustine grass, so uniformly green it looked artificial, punctuated by 3 identical cone-shaped holly bushes that seemed to have been shaped by a laser. It was sterile, lifeless, and, to his mind, profoundly ugly. "Well, I suppose beauty is in the eye of the beholder," he said, his tone still mild. Brenda's eyes narrowed. She was not accustomed to being calmly contradicted. She thrived on escalation, on emotional reactions she could then label as unneighborly behavior. David's placid demeanor was like a damp sponge on her simmering fire. "It's not about the beholder, David. It's about the rules, the CC&Rs. You signed them, just like the rest of us. You'll be hearing about this, formally." She turned on her heel and marched away, her sensible walking shoes thudding on the concrete with indignant purpose. David watched her go, a small, wry smile touching his lips for the first time that morning. He turned back to his garden, the sun now a little higher in the sky. He picked a ripe, sun-warmed cherry tomato from the vine and popped it into his mouth. It burst with a sweetness that no grocery store could ever replicate. The peace had been disturbed. The opening salvo had been fired. Brenda thought she was declaring a war, but David knew better. War was chaos, noise, and unpredictability. This wasn't a war. This was a logistical problem, and David Anderson was very, very good at solving logistical problems. His mission was now clear: protect the sanctuary. The operation had begun. 3 days later, the formal declaration arrived. It wasn't slipped into his mailbox with the usual collection of circulars and bills. It came via certified mail, a deliberate act of bureaucratic intimidation that required his signature. The crisp, green and white envelope felt important in his hand, a tangible escalation from Brenda's sidewalk sermon. Inside, on thick letterhead bearing the HOA's grandiose cypress tree logo, was a single sheet of paper that was cold, impersonal, and utterly devoid of the passion Brenda had displayed. Passion was for the field. This was the sterile language of the command center. Official notice of violation date, July 16, 2025 to David Anderson, 1247, Azalea Bloom, away from the Preserve at Cypress Creek Architectural Review Committee violation. In accordance with the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, of the Preserve at Cypress Creek, your property has been found to be in violation of Article 7, Section 4, Landscaping and Maintenance. This section states, all front yard landscaping must be of an ornamental nature and be maintained in a manner that preserves the harmonious and aesthetically pleasing standards of the community. Specifics: the vegetable gardens located in your front yard are deemed non-ornamental and agricultural in nature, thus violating the established community aesthetic. Required action: you are required to completely remove the vegetable gardens and all related structures from your front yard within 14 days of the date of this notice. The area must be replaced with sod or pre-approved ornamental shrubbery. Penalty for non-compliance: failure to comply will result in a fine of $50 per day until the violation is rectified. The letter was signed by Brenda Thompson in her official capacity as chair. David read the letter twice. He felt no anger, no panic. Instead, a familiar feeling settled over him. The quiet focus that comes when you are presented with a complex problem and a clear objective. The enemy had stated their position and their terms. Now, it was time for reconnaissance. He walked over to the bookshelf in his study, a room as organized as his garden. He pulled out a thick, 3-ring binder with a simple label on the spine: HOA. Inside were the CC&Rs, the bylaws, the community rules and regulations, every piece of paper he'd been given at closing. For years, it had sat unread, a sleeping dragon. Now, it was time to wake it up. With a cup of black coffee at his side, he began to read. He didn't just skim, he analyzed, a yellow highlighter in his hand. He treated the document like an enemy's battle plan, looking for weaknesses, ambiguities, and contradictions. An hour passed, then 2. He cross-referenced sections, made notes in the margins, and tabbed key pages. He paid special attention to Article 7, Section 4. The phrase ornamental nature was highlighted, with a question mark next to it. He flipped through the entire document. Nowhere was the term ornamental defined. There was no list of approved plants. There was no list of prohibited plants, save for a few specific invasive species. The dragon, it turned out, had soft spots. Later that afternoon, as he was watering his peppers, Eleanor Peterson from across the street made her way over. She was a widow in her late 70s, a kind woman who lived alone and whose Social Security check didn't always stretch as far as she needed it to. David made sure she had a steady supply of fresh vegetables, which she often turned into a delicious zucchini bread or tomato soup, a small portion of which always found its way back to his doorstep. "David," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I saw the mailman have you sign for something, and Brenda was talking to Mary Ann by the community pool. She was so proud of herself. She said she was finally putting a stop to the farm stand on Azalea Bloom Way." Her eyes were filled with genuine worry. "Oh, David, I hope you're not in trouble." Is it because I told everyone at the book club how wonderful your cucumbers are? I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have." David put down his watering can and gave her a warm, reassuring smile. He saw in her face the real stakes of this conflict. This wasn't just about his right to grow food. It was about protecting the quiet fabric of community, about standing up for people like Eleanor who were easily intimidated by the Brendas of the world. He was fighting for his peace, but he was also fighting for hers. "Eleanor, you have absolutely nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "A compliment is never a crime, and don't you worry about Brenda. This is just a disagreement over gardening philosophies." "But the fines, David," she was talking about fines. "The best fertilizer is a little bit of resolve, Eleanor," he said, a maxim he'd just invented, but which felt true. "Everything is going to be fine. Now, how about you take a look at these bell peppers? I think a few of them are ready to be picked." He managed to distract her, sending her home with a bag of produce and a slightly less worried expression. But as he watched her walk away, her steps a little slower than they were a year ago, his own resolve hardened. This was no longer a simple logistical problem. It had become a matter of principle. Brenda and the HOA had chosen to target his sanctuary, and in doing so, they had inadvertently threatened the well-being of his friend. They had misjudged their opponent. They thought they were dealing with a quiet retiree. They had no idea they were taking on a man who had spent his entire adult life ensuring that plans were followed, that objectives were met, and that the people under his care were protected. That evening, he expanded his reconnaissance. He took a slow, deliberate walk through the entire preserve at Cypress Creek, his smartphone in hand. He wasn't enjoying the sunset. He was gathering intelligence. He photographed the lawn ornaments, the gnomes, the flamingos, the concrete lighthouses. He photographed the decorative non-native grasses that looked half dead. He photographed a rose garden that was nothing but thorny sticks, its seasonal beauty long faded. He photographed a garish purple fountain in one yard and an abstract metal sculpture in another. His evidence file was growing. The charge was selective enforcement, and he was building a powerful case. The final piece of his strategy, however, came not from the neighborhood, but from the wider world. Back in his study, he typed a few key phrases into his search engine: Florida HOA law, homeowner gardening rights, HOA vegetable restrictions. And there it was. His keyboard clicked, the printer whirred, and a single sheet of paper emerged. It was the text of a state law, a law that Brenda Thompson and the Architectural Review Committee had either willfully ignored or were completely ignorant of. He read it over, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. It was the final, decisive piece of ammunition he needed. The plan of action was complete. Now, all he had to do was wait for the meeting. The 14-day clock wasn't just ticking for him. It was ticking for them. The preserve at Cypress Creek Community Room was a place designed to have no character at all. It was a beige box, smelling faintly of stale coffee and industrial-strength carpet cleaner. The air was heavy and still, barely stirred by the wheezing air conditioner unit in the window. Fluorescent lights hummed from the ceiling, casting a flat, unflattering glare on the 24 residents scattered among the rows of stackable chairs. It was a room designed for compliance, a place where enthusiasm went to die. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table draped with a cheap polyester tablecloth, sat the HOA board. In the center, like a queen holding court, was Brenda Thompson. She radiated an aura of smug satisfaction. To her left sat the HOA president, a perpetually tired-looking man named Frank Miller, who ran a local insurance agency and clearly viewed his HOA duties as a necessary evil. The other members looked similarly uninspired, their postures slumped, their faces betraying a desire to be anywhere else. David sat in the front row, directly in front of Brenda. He was dressed simply in a collared polo shirt and khaki pants. He had a slim leather portfolio resting on his lap. He was perfectly still, his back straight, his breathing even. He looked like a man waiting for a scheduled flight, not a man about to be publicly condemned. After the droning recitation of the previous meeting's minutes and a tedious treasurer's report, Frank Miller cleared his throat. All right, the next item on the agenda is a review of a violation at 1247 Azalea Bloom Way. Brenda, as chair of the Architectural Review Committee, you have the floor. This was Brenda's moment. She stood up, a sheaf of papers in her hand. She adopted a somber, serious tone, as if she were announcing a national tragedy. Thank you, Frank. Fellow residents, it is with a heavy heart that I bring this issue before you, she began, her eyes sweeping the room. As you know, our community is a special place. We are a preserve. We are defined by our commitment to beauty, harmony, and, as a direct result, our property values. She paused for effect. Unfortunately, that harmony is being threatened. She clicked a remote, and an image flashed onto the portable screen set up behind her. It was a photo of David's garden, taken from a low angle on an overcast day, making it look damp and cluttered. This is the front yard of 1247 Azalea Bloom Way, she said, her voice filled with feigned sorrow. As you can see, what we have here is not landscaping. It is a full-blown farming operation. While some may find this sort of thing charming in a rural setting, it is a flagrant violation of our community standards as codified in our CC&Rs. She clicked through several more unflattering photos. The rules are clear. Article 7, Section 4, mandates that all landscaping be ornamental in nature. I ask you, is there anything ornamental about a dirt patch? Is there anything aesthetically pleasing about produce that belongs in a grocery store aisle? The committee's position is firm. This is an unacceptable breach of the rules that we all, as homeowners, have agreed to live by. She laid out her case with the unshakable certainty of a zealot. She spoke of curb appeal, of the precedent it would set, of the creeping blight of individualism. She painted a picture of a neighborhood on the verge of collapse, all because of one man's tomatoes. Throughout her entire 15-minute presentation, David did not move. He did not scowl or sigh or shake his head. He simply watched and listened, his expression neutral. He let her expend all her ammunition, let her build her case on a foundation of emotion and subjectivity. He recognized the tactic, overwhelm with rhetoric, frame the opponent as unreasonable, and steamroll to a conclusion before logic can find its footing. It was a weak strategy, effective only against the unprepared. When she finally finished her tirade and sat down looking triumphant, Frank Miller turned to David. "Mr. Anderson, do you have anything to say in response?" David slowly rose to his feet. The portfolio remained in his hand, unopened. He faced the board, but his voice was clear and carried easily through the small room. "Yes, I do. Thank you, Frank. And thank you, Brenda, for that very passionate presentation." He began, his tone respectful and disarmingly mild. The contrast with Brenda's high-strung performance was immediate and stark. "I have the letter from your committee," he continued, "and I have reviewed our governing documents thoroughly. The entire case against my garden seems to rest on a single phrase, of an ornamental nature. So, my question for the committee is simple." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. He looked directly at Brenda. "Could you please point me to the specific section in our CC&Rs or any other community document that provides a legal, actionable definition of the word ornamental?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it seemed to hang in the air like a puff of smoke. Brenda, who had been expecting a fight, an argument, or a plea for an exception, was visibly taken aback. "Well, it's common sense," she sputtered, her composure beginning to fray. "Ornamental means it's for decoration, like flowers or bushes, not food." David gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if she were a student giving an interesting but incomplete answer. "So, it's your position that this is based on common sense, rather than a written rule?" he asked calmly. "Whose common sense? Yours? Mine? What about Frank's? Or Mrs. Peterson's across the street?" He let his gaze drift over the other residents. "I ask because beauty is a subjective concept. For instance, many people find flowering herbs like lavender and rosemary to be highly ornamental. Both grow in my garden. A pepper plant with vibrant red, yellow, and orange fruit is, to many eyes, far more beautiful than a simple green bush. An artichoke plant produces a stunning, deep purple flower if you let it. Is that not ornamental?" He was no longer just asking a question. He was dissecting her entire premise, piece by piece, with the calm precision of a surgeon. The mood in the room began to shift. The bored, tired expressions on the faces of the residents were being replaced by looks of genuine interest. They were no longer watching a public shaming. They were watching a masterclass. Brenda's face was turning a shade of pink that clashed with her blonde hair. "This is ridiculous. You're twisting words." "On the contrary," David replied, his voice still perfectly even. "I am asking for words to be defined. In the absence of a written definition, a pre-approved plant list, or any objective criteria, your committee is not enforcing a rule. It is enforcing its personal taste, and that, I believe, is an overreach of its authority." He hadn't even opened his portfolio yet. He hadn't raised his voice. But with a few simple, logical questions, he had seized complete control of the room. The foundation of Brenda's case was crumbling, and she knew it. The confrontation had reached its midpoint, and the power had decisively shifted. The beige room was now charged with a silence that was anything but empty. It was filled with the dawning realization of the other board members and the piqued curiosity of the residents. Brenda Thompson, for her part, was floundering. Her case, which had seemed so righteous and unassailable in her own mind, was dissolving under the gentle but relentless pressure of David's logic. "It doesn't matter if it's not defined," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "It's about the spirit of the rule. The spirit is to maintain property values." "I'm glad you brought that up," David said, his tone still conversational. He finally opened the portfolio. He didn't pull out a document, however. He pulled out a series of 8 Kodak 10 full-color photographs. He walked calmly to the table and laid the first one down in front of Frank Miller. It was a picture of a lawn 2 streets over, adorned with a flock of a dozen plastic pink flamingos. "Is this ornamental?" David asked quietly. He laid down another photo, a concrete statue of a jockey, painted in garish colors. "How about this? Does this enhance our harmonious aesthetic?" Another photo, a sprawling rose garden, but the picture was clearly taken in the dead of winter, showing a tangled mass of thorny, brown sticks. "This is a pre-approved plant, I assume? Is it ornamental year-round?" He continued, laying down photo after photo from his reconnaissance mission. The yard with the rusting metal sculpture, the lawn with the gnomes, the house with the peeling paint on its decorative shutters. "My point," he said, his voice resonating with authority now, "is that beauty is subjective, but rules cannot be. To penalize my clean, organized, and productive garden while allowing these," he gestured to the array of photos, "is the very definition of selective enforcement. And selective enforcement is not just unfair, it's illegal. It delegitimizes the HOA's authority to enforce any rule." The board members stared at the pictures, then at each other. They had no answer. They all knew the houses in the photos. They had all driven past them for years, shaking their heads perhaps, but never commissioning a formal violation letter. David had exposed their hypocrisy, not with anger, but with undeniable photographic proof. Brenda looked at the photos, her face a storm of fury and humiliation. She had been beaten at her own game. But David wasn't finished. This was just the tactical victory. It was time for the strategic checkmate. He reached back into his portfolio and pulled out the single sheet of paper he had printed a few nights earlier. He held it up. "But even if we were to ignore the vagueness of the rule, and even if we were to ignore the clear-as-day selective enforcement," he said, letting every word land with weight, "there is a much larger issue at play, and that is the law of the state of Florida." A murmur went through the room. This was an escalation no one had expected. "I'd like to draw the board's attention," David said, his eyes locking onto Frank Miller's, "to Florida Statute 60471, also known as the Right to Garden Act. It was signed into law to protect a homeowner's right to do exactly what I am doing." He began to read from the paper, his voice clear and steady. "A homeowner may not be charged a fine for a vegetable garden on their property unless the garden is otherwise prohibited by state or federal law. A homeowners association may not prohibit a homeowner from installing a vegetable garden in their front yard or on their property." He paused, letting the words sink in. It goes on to say that an HOA can place reasonable restrictions on things like setbacks and irrigation, all of which my garden fully complies with. But what it explicitly states, what the legislature of our state has made unequivocally clear, is that a homeowners association in Florida cannot prohibit a homeowner from growing their own food for personal consumption. He placed the printout of the statute on the table on top of the pile of photographs. "Your violation notice is not just based on a vague rule. It's not just being selectively enforced. It is, in fact, demanding that I break no rule in order to comply with a demand that is itself illegal under state law. Your rule is null and void. It is legally unenforceable." Checkmate. The room was utterly silent for a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner, which suddenly seemed very loud. Brenda Thompson sank back into her chair as if her bones had turned to dust. The color had drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, defeated shell. She stared at the paper on the table as if it were her own death warrant. Frank Miller picked up the printout. He read it, his brow furrowed. He passed it to the board member next to him, who pulled out his phone and began typing furiously. After a moment, the board member's eyes widened, and he showed his phone to Frank. Frank sighed, a deep, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the entire evening. He looked at David, not with animosity, but with a kind of grudging respect. He looked at Brenda, whose reign of terror over petty aesthetic matters had just collided with the unyielding wall of state law. "Well," Frank said, clearing his throat and straightening his tie, "it appears Mr. Anderson has done his homework." The understatement of the year. In light of this information, it would be imprudent to proceed. I'd like to call for a motion to immediately withdraw the violation notice for 1247 Azalea Bloom Way. "Seconded," a voice from the end of the table piped up immediately. "All in favor?" Frank asked. Every hand on the board shot up except for one. Brenda sat frozen, her hands in her lap, defeated. "The motion passes," Frank declared, a note of finality in his voice. He looked at David. "Mr. Anderson, our apologies. The matter is closed." David simply gave a single, respectful nod to the board. He gathered his photos and the printout of the statute, placed them neatly back in his portfolio, and closed it with a soft click. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the beige room, leaving a stunned silence and the wreckage of Brenda Thompson's authority in his wake. He had come not to fight, but to educate. And the lesson had been delivered. The garden hadn't changed. 4 raised beds still stood in quiet formation beneath the morning sun. But David Anderson had. In confronting the HOA, he hadn't just defended his vegetables, he had reclaimed a piece of himself. The soldier, the strategist, the protector, all parts long dormant, had stirred once more, not in anger, but in quiet clarity. He had remembered who he was beneath the peaceful routine, someone who stood for order, yes, but also for justice. And he'd learned that the most important battles in life aren't always fought overseas or with weapons. They're fought at home, sometimes in silence, with facts, compassion, and resolve. They're about neighbors, dignity, and the simple right to live meaningfully on your own land. In the end, David's fight was not against rules, but against fear, the kind that keeps good people quiet. And by standing tall, he reminded an entire street that peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of courage. That morning, a bee hovered gently over a basil flower. The leaves shimmered with dew, the earth still warm from yesterday's sun. David stood there, hands in his pockets, breathing it all in. The garden, once a retreat, had become a legacy.